Hello and welcome to this tutorial about how to record Jettons and tokens onto the PAS database. Collectively, Jettons and tokens are called paranumismatica. The term is a modern coining from para, meaning beside or beyond, and numismatic, meaning pertaining to coins. So we take it to mean things like coins, but which were not coins. This includes Jettons and tokens, as mentioned, as well as medals and medallions, which we will not cover in this video. Like coins, items of paranumismatica are metallic discs, generally thin, struck from dies or cast to take on a design on one, but more often both sides. But as mentioned, they were not coins of the realm. They didn't have the kind of level of authority behind their value, which enabled them to be used in anything other than low-level transactions. That is, in a localised context, they could be used for low-level transactions, and tokens, particularly those made in copper alloy or silver, did have a monetary function at this low level. Jettons were not intended to have transactional function, which is not the same as saying they weren't used for this purpose in a local context, but this is something that is more complicated to prove, although it has been argued for strongly and persuasively by some by comparing Jetton use with that of small coin denominations. Jettons and tokens are further distinguished from coins by their physical properties. Most jettons that we encounter are of various copper-based alloys, at a time that most contemporary coinage was in silver. Tokens were often in copper alloys too, to distinguish them from contemporary silver coins. They were also in lead alloys, which for long periods distinguished them from contemporary copper alloy coinages. The proportion of database records relating to jettons and tokens is 3.2%, or about 3 in every 100. Before we move on to function, let's situate ourselves in time. We'll start with tokens, which are on the top of the diagram. The tokens we encounter through the Portable Antiquities Scheme are generally of medieval date. So for the purposes of this video, tokens appear sometime in the 11th or 12th century. In Salisbury, specifically the 12th to 13th century site of Old Sarum, tokens have been found which allow for a 12th century date archaeologically, and which, in design terms, are reminiscent of 12th century coin types. Tokens were also found in 12th century contexts at Bull Wharf in London. Early tokens were made of lead and lead alloy, and continue through the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries. A token coinage in copper alloy was prefigured by the issue of tokens in the 1570s in Bristol under royal approval. Then, the phenomenon of copper alloy tokens became national once the last royal licences issued for the production of farthings elapsed. From 1648, the production of copper alloy tokens continued for about a quarter of a century, until they were declared illegal following the institution of new base metal fractions from 1672, proclamations that had to be reissued in 1673 and 1674. In the late 18th century and in the early 19th century, there were two more occurrences of provincial token coinage, which were again largely provoked by a lack of small change. Around this time, and going later, other types of token came on the scene. Hop tokens, communion tokens, and so forth. In the 19th and early 20th century, copper alloyed pub tokens were issued by various establishments for a number of purposes. Turning now to jettons, which are at the bottom of the diagram, the story is somewhat less complicated. Jettons appear on the scene in England towards the end of the 13th century. Made from copper alloys, they continue right the way through to the 18th century. But around the middle of the 17th century, there is a gradual shift in their function. Let us now look at jettons in more detail. For years, jettons were neglected archaeologically in England, but it began to dawn on archaeologists and numismatists that jettons could actually provide quite tight dating evidence. Dates of deposition for jettons do seem to follow fairly closely the dates of production. The main function of the jetton in medieval and early post-medieval periods was as a counter. In the Middle Ages, complex calculations were not facilitated by the Arabic numerals that we use today, but rather the Roman numerals, which were unwieldy when it came to performing sums. To facilitate arithmetic, Jettons would be lined up in rows on lines that represented different numeral values. Jettons would then be moved along lines and across columns, and where necessary up and down the columns, to perform the sums, much as with using beads on an abacus. The derivation of the word jeton is from the French verb jeter, to throw, and it was said until quite recently that one would cast accounts. So this accountancy function was the prime role of the jeton for much of its existence. Indeed, many of the German examples bear the inscription Rechenpfennig, or reckoning penny. There were a number of dedicated surfaces onto which people could perform their calculations. For example, you could use a counting board engraved with lines or rows, or something more readily transported, like a counting cloth. You could even use distinctive thick jettons to represent the numerical values, meaning that all you required was a flat, clean surface that was big enough. And to this day, we buy our goods over the counter, which alludes to this. The fabulous jeton pictured here shows them in use. Cloths were often decorated in a checkerboard pattern. A document called Dialogue of the Exchequer, dated to 1176, refers to such a cloth, a huge one measuring 10 feet by 5 feet, on which counters were moved around. The term persists to this day in the form of the title Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's thought that such a system of exchequer reckoning was developed towards the start of the 12th century, during the reign of Henry I. The gap in time between this and the first jettons is presumably explained by alternative discoidal counters being used that we wouldn't recognise as jettons, probably coins themselves or possibly plain discs like those found at Bull Wharf. After hundreds of years of use as counters, the role of jettons began to change. With the widespread adoption of today's Arabic numerals from around the 1630s, jettons started to become redundant as tools of accountancy. It's likely that by the 18th century, most jettons were being used as Spielmarken or card counters instead. These then are not really part of our story. Most medieval jettons are made of an alloy known at the time as latten. This is, in effect, a low zinc brass, one that has a relatively high tin content, making it reasonably resistant to corrosion. Some jettons even boast of the fact through inscriptions such as Je suis de latten belle, I am of handsome latten. The copper used was from Sweden, brought into European centres via the merchants of the Hanseatic League. However, things changed when newly discovered copper began infiltrating the market from Austro-Hungary in the 15th century. This was transported by the Fuggers of Augsburg to Antwerp, and one of its stopping off points was in Nuremberg, where a factory was established in 1486. At Nuremberg, jettons began to be made in calamine brass, that is, with a far higher zinc content compared to the preceding latten jettons. Compare the two examples pictured here, a browner, more coppery medieval latten jeton, and a more yellowy, brassy post-medieval jeton struck at Nuremberg. We can also have a look at the jettons themselves to observe to an extent how they were made. This medieval jeton was made from a blank which had been centred, leaving a punch mark in the middle of the flan. That the blank was at some point rotated is suggested by the curved line that emanates from the central punch. By contrast, this post-medieval jeton was subject to a more serialised process of production. Designs were struck adjacently onto strips of brass, and jettons then cut out using a ring punch. We can see that when they struck the jettons, they did in such haste that the jettons were too close together. When they were stamped out, the punch would cut into the next jeton, leaving a curved loss or crescentic cutout, as shown here. When it comes to identifying Jettons, we are fortunate in that they can be divided into major groups relating to their origin. These groups form a fairly coherent sequence through time as regards when they were used in England. There are four main sources. The main source of Jettons used in England in the late 13th and early 14th centuries was England. The star is over London, as this is thought to be their main place of manufacture, as we'll discuss in a moment. You get a trail of English Jettons into the late 14th century, but from around 1350, the Jettons used in England mostly come from France. This predominance lasted around a century. The star is over Paris, but French Jettons are thought to have been made in a number of different places. By the later 15th century, most Jettons were being struck at Tournai in modern-day Belgium. Here's where it starts to get a bit complicated. At the time, Tournai was a French royal mint. Indeed, Jettons had been struck here before the mid-15th century. But, as noted, it's in the later 15th century that Tournai is preeminent in supplying Jettons used in England. In this sense, the late Tournai category into which we place these 15th century Jettons is even more artificial than most archaeological categories. Our fourth main source is Nuremberg in modern-day Germany. This takes over from Tournai in the first quarter of the 16th century as the major supplier of Jettons to England. Nuremberg remained the main centre of production through the 17th and into the 18th century. There are a few other sources for Jettons that we record, but they are neither as plentiful as the big four, nor do they fit the rather neat chronological story of English, then French, then late Tournai, then Nuremberg Jettons. We get a few very early Jettons, which predate even the English series. These tend to be grouped as early French or Italian, with Jettons such as those shown in the top row attributed to bankers from Lombardy. There are also Anglo-Gallic Jettons, which were struck in France for use in the English provinces in the 14th and early 15th centuries, not shown here. These are extremely rare, and together with the early French or Italian pieces, you can probably count the PAS database example on one, maybe two hands. You'll encounter the term Anglo-Gallic in the early literature, but in almost every circumstance, what the authors once termed Anglo-Gallic we are now calling English. Another source for Jettons is the Low Countries, such as the example shown in the bottom row. Note the fire steel, which looks a bit like a crown. It's characteristic of Burgundian Jettons from the Low Countries. This has a flat base and two arms that curve around at either end for holding. You can see from this pie chart that about 97% of Jettons we record come from the main four areas of origin. Dwarfing everything are the post-medieval Jettons from Nuremberg, about 7 out of every 10 Jettons you're likely to encounter. Then, in fairly even proportions, we have Jettons from England, France, and the late Tournai group. There are 6 reference works that are particularly useful for working with Jettons. The first 3 listed are specific. Duniol focuses on Jettons of the Low Countries, whilst Berry and Murnick are specifically on English Jettons. Of the other 3, Barnard is very old, but is still an impressive piece of work that is useful. As a general aside, many of the references for paranumismatica are quite old, and there is scope for much to be done on this subject, not least using PAS data. Both Barnard and the Murnick and Alga book cover a range of Jettons. However, Murnick and Alga is part of a medieval catalogue, and so it stops in about 1550. Michener's work is an extremely useful book containing over 2,500 Jettons encounters. It's not fully comprehensive, as it details only what has been recovered from the Thames foreshore. And it's also 30 years old, so a small proportion of details are out of date. However, it is the work that has informed much of the dating of Jettons and the structure of the drop-downs that we use on the database to record them. The main issue is that it's hard to get hold of a copy and it's rather expensive, so the best thing to do is ask your fines liaison officer. Let's start with England. From the late 13th century, we start to get Jettons that we know were being made in England. These were decorated on both sides. Returning to the point that coins were being used for accountancy purposes before Jettons, we can suggest that there was a close relationship between coins and Jettons because the earliest Jettons made in this country were struck with dies that employed the punches used for the pennies of Edward I. See the comparison pictured in the top row. Numismatists, that is those who study coins, have traced this connection through the pennies of Edward II, particularly by looking at changes in the punch used to make the crown on the dies. The connection is less direct in the middle of the 14th century, but scholars have suggested that an increase in size of Jettons coincided with an increase in the size of silver coins, when multiple denominations, namely half-groats and groats, were introduced in the 1340s. But these Jettons no longer bore the same designs as the coinage. You'll notice that the Jettons have a central punch mark. This punch is characteristic of English Jettons and is thought to relate to the centering of the flan during production. It had the added benefit of ensuring that it was difficult to pass them off successfully as coins of the realm. Sometimes the punch developed into a central piercing, like the one pictured top right. Most English Jettons are anepigraphic, that is, they do not have a legend, or sometimes the legend is nonsense. So when identifying English Jettons, look for the central punch and use the classification in the Berry book. They are subdivided into 5 groups. Group 1, the sterling and allied issues, which represent by far the most common type of English Jetton. These are the ones linked to the contemporary silver pennies, as mentioned earlier. Group 2, the early wardrobe Jettons. These are larger than the sterling issues and might have been used as wardrobe counters relating to the king's personal expenditure, hence the name. They tend to have pellet borders and a cross moline. Group 3, the mid to late 14th century types. These are slightly larger and inspired by French coins. The most common reverse on these types are the king under a canopy and the seated king. Group 4, the late wardrobe series. These are even larger and are thought to be wardrobe counters of the second half of the 14th century, hence the name again. Group 5. The final subgroup consists of contemporary copies of other Jettons. Next we have French Jettons. Certain Jettons made in France are contemporary with those made in England in the second half of the 14th century, and only a very few days earlier. It's important to note that certain designs, such as the standing king and seated king, are seen on both French and English issues, as they share the same coin designs as prototypes. The French Jettons can be distinguished from English ones in 2 ways. The flan will not have a central punch, and many feature a legend. A main feature to look for on French Jettons is an elaborate but generally neat reverse cross. These crosses generally have multiple strands and their arms terminate in lee. The most common is a triple-stranded straight cross with a double quadrilobe border. The classification of French Jettons is based on their obverse design. Designs from this early period include the Moor's head type, the crown, the shield of France, ancient and modern, the seated or standing king, and designs alluding to the provinces such as the Bear of Languedoc. The predominant legend is the Hail Mary, Ave Maria Gracia Plena, often with the final word abbreviated. Use Michener when recording French Jettons. Turning now to Jettons from Tournai. Tournai, in modern-day Belgium, was an official French mint. It came to dominate production from the 15th century until the very early 16th century, especially from around 1450, and so it's useful to isolate as a separate category following on from the more general French production in this period. The obverse types for Tournai in this period fall into 2 main groups. The first is a group of derivative French designs. They are struck more crudely than earlier Jettons and on larger, thicker flans. In particular, look for crown types and shields of France modern. Other characteristic traits of this group include saltire cross initial marks and the presence of letters on the reverse cusps rather than florets. The second group consists of relatively neat Jettons with a reverse design of a cross potent with flowers in each angle. They often have a legend based on Sit Nomen Domini, from Sit Nomen Domini Benedictum, blessed be the name of the Lord, with the ends often unbarred. Obverse types include angular shields, 3 circles and monograms. This group tends to be dated to around 1475 to 1525. The last of the big four are the Nuremberg Jettons. Although Nuremberg dominated later Jetton production, its rapid rise came only in the last few decades of the 15th century, at the very end of the medieval period. The earliest Jettons attributable to Nuremberg fall into 2 groups. The first are broadly 15th century in date. They measure around 19 to 20 millimetres in diameter and depict local German devices such as shields of arms and iconographic motifs. The second group are far larger and imitate devices from other locations, such as Burgundy and France. The latter continued into the post-medieval period, where they were joined by designs which would become far more common, not least the rose orb Jettons. Post-medieval Jettons from Nuremberg can be broadly divided by their obverse design, the most common one being crowns and lee, alternating around a central rose. These designs, which also include the Lion of St. Mark and the ship penny, tend to be paired with an orb within an elaborate trilobe on the reverse. The issues of Nuremberg can also be divided between early examples, which feature fictitious legends dating to the first 3/4 of the 16th century, and examples from around 1550 onwards, which are signed by their manufacturers, the most prolific of which being the Crauwinkels and the Schultes family and the Laufers. From the 1580s, Jettons became far neater, following minting reforms. They have literate inscriptions formed of Roman lettering and regular diaxis measurements. Roses tend to be formed of either 8 petals or 6 bilobed petals. The rose orb type is very commonly encountered, and those issued by Hans Crauwinkel II are some of the most frequently found. Some common inscriptions on Hans Crauwinkel II rose orb Jettons are shown here. From the mid-16th century, Jettons were increasingly used for gaming, all the more so as they began to lose their accountancy function from the second quarter of the 17th century. Nuremberg Jettons of the 17th and 18th centuries have a variety of designs, some allegorical, others in imitation of presentation pieces or show Jettons relating to countries such as England and France. After the middle of the 17th century, copper alloy Jettons ceased to have an accountancy function at all, and tended to be used in gaming and gambling instead. They and the 18th century examples can still be interesting to record though. Now we'll move on to how to record Jettons onto the database once you've identified them. Jetton is obviously the general object type to use for these objects. However, there are some exceptions. Jettons were sometimes repurposed into other objects, as shown here. For these, we follow the convention that the object type should be the last use of the object. Some Jettons, for example, were converted into brooches by the attachment of pin fittings, as seen here, or a double-ended clip through their centre. This happens most commonly on English Jettons, and, of those, most often on early large module examples. The Jetton illustrated here of the Lombard bankers is extremely rare, but similarly an early example of a Jetton. For these, brooch is to be used for the object type, with Jetton in the classification field. As you can see, you also get pins formed of two Jettons that have been dished and attached together. Contrary to the brooch phenomenon, which seems to focus on the earliest part of Jetton use in the late 13th and first half of the 14th centuries, the Jettons used to make pins are all far later. Such pins imitate a pin form in use in the late 15th and 16th century, and seem to be exclusively made from Nuremberg Jettons. We've recorded some early rose orb issues and some later issues attributable to Hans Crowwinkel II, which confirms a broadly 16th century date. It goes without saying that these are recorded with pin as the object type. Sometimes you get detached hemispheres from such pin heads. It's not out of the question that similar things happen to repurposed Jettons as buttons, although it's obviously somewhat harder to tell whether a Jetton was converted once the fittings have become detached. So unless you have evidence of fittings, it's best to err on the side of caution and record it as a Jetton. For Jettons, there's no need to fill in the classification or subclassification fields, as we'll be completing a numismatic data form later on. Jettons will be put down as either medieval or post-medieval for the broad period. Dating is generally taken from Michener. If you are uncertain, dates have been embedded into the drop-downs, more on which in a moment, which you can make a note of and add into the date from and date to fields once you've completed the numismatic form. Jettons will be, by and large, made of copper alloy in terms of primary material, and the ones we record will be struck or hammered as regards method of manufacture. Now to the drop-downs. Jetton is one of the few object types which generates an extra form into which numismatic data can be inputted once you have saved the core data. Here's what it looks like. A series of drop-downs followed by free text fields into which you can add details present on the obverse and reverse, and finally a drop-down to record a diaxis measurement. Regardless of whether medieval or post-medieval has been put for the broad period, a form with the same structure will come up. They've been designed so that the first three drop-downs are interconnected, so what you select in the first drop-down will dictate the options you get in the succeeding drop-downs. You start by selecting a class of Jetton. This is a very high-level choice which relates to the origin of the Jetton. You will probably most commonly use Nuremberg, then English, French and Tournai. Having chosen that, you can then select a group. The group differs depending on which class you have chosen. For the most part, the group is based on the main design, as discussed earlier. For England, things are slightly different. This is because when the drop-downs were created for the PAS database, there were no established schema for the most part, but there were some suggested divisions for English Jettons. It's these subdivisions that are used in the drop-down. Moving on to the third drop-down, type, here you can see a worked example for a French Jetton. The class is French, with a Shield of France Ancient obverse design. The group is France Ancient. You can see here that the type drop-down is used to subdivide types, that is, main designs, by issuer. For this example, you have the choice between Shield of France Ancient Jettons issued by Jean de Quint and those unnamed examples where we don't know the issuer. This comes into its own when you are recording Nuremberg Jettons of named issuers. You can see that this is where the Michener number or range is embedded. That's the number after the capital M, and also the dates of issue, following Michener. There are two exceptions to mention. With Nuremberg Jettons, the rose orb issues of Hans Crowwinkel II are so prolific that we've used the type of token drop-down to further subdivide these by inscription. When you record one of these, therefore, having chosen class as Nuremberg and group as Rose Orb, you will find a choice based on the legend. The other exception relates to English Jettons. You'll remember that these were treated differently in the group drop-downs, and this has a knock-on effect in the type drop-down. Effectively, the criterion has been shunted down a level, so the types for English Jettons tend to relate to designs and the classification devised for them by Berry. The next few drop-downs are not so cleverly interconnected, but they are fairly straightforward to fill in. They are denomination, ruler, and mint. For denomination, select Jetton. For ruler here, read issuer and complete this for the Nuremberg Jetton makers. And for mint, the only ones we have a degree of certainty over are Tournai for the late issues and Nuremberg. After degree of wear, you are on to the free text fields for describing the obverse and the reverse. The conventions for these fields are like those used for coin recording, like the example shown at the top here. Descriptions are generally taken from reference works or database records, with any jargon explained or rewritten. As usual, inscriptions are rendered as on the Jetton, including letter forms. However, when it comes to the object description field on the core data form, names can be normalised. Finally, the die-axis measurement should be recorded. The diagram here explains how to do this. Hold the Jetton between thumb and forefinger with the obverse facing you and the right way up. Spin the Jetton 180 degrees, and if the image on the reverse is the right way up, then the measurement is 12 o'clock. If the image on the reverse is upside down, then the measurement is 6 o'clock. Let us now turn our attention to tokens. As mentioned earlier, for the purposes of this video, tokens first appear sometime in the 11th or 12th century, and their use continues into the early 20th century. The vast majority recorded on the PAS database are post-medieval in date, from around 1500 to 1700 AD. Tokens seem to have served two main functions. The first as symbols of receipt for either goods or services, and second, acting as small change at times when such low-level denominations were lacking in the currency. The earliest tokens belonged to the first category and were received for services or as alms, and could be redeemed for food and drink, for example, or for money. In 15th century St. Omer, for example, the church chapter distributed tokens to workmen, who could redeem them at inns on an approved list. Pilgrimage can be cited as another early context of distribution and use. If an ecclesiastical context for use and production was the initial one, it was soon joined in the 14th century by secular issuers. Their use in minor transactions by various professions is taken from various petitions and actions to prohibit their use by the Crown. However, the main point at which tokens took on a role in minor transactions was during the 17th century and the flourishing of trade tokens. As noted, this recurred in the late 18th century and again in the early 19th century. Other modern tokens served a multiplicity of uses. With regard to metallurgy, we can note changes in raw material through time. Tokens start out being made from lead-tin alloys, for example pewter, and are generally cast in stone moulds. They changed to lead in the 14th century, implying secular involvement. By the 15th century, the tokens included lead-tin alloys again, and a mixed series continued through time all the way through to the early 19th century, although the Boy Bishop series, you can see, were almost exclusively lead pieces. By the late 16th century, there were clear problems in enacting small transactions due to a lack of small change in silver, so a token coinage in copper alloy came about, first in the 1570s in Bristol under royal approval, and then on a national basis until 1672. Later tokens are also copper alloy. Here is a list of the most useful reference sources when working with tokens. Early lead tokens are extremely rare and are not found very often outside urban contexts. Pictorial tokens can be found illustrated in Michener and Skinner's 1983 paper. These date to the 13th and 14th centuries mainly, and are extremely rare as PAS finds. They are mainly known from large caches in London and Dublin. We have traced a handful on the PAS database, one from near Battersea Park, and this one shown here from near Peterborough depicting a bishop. Subsequent series known from the London waterfront are absent from the PAS finds, although we can note that sometime around the middle of the 14th century, pictorial tokens gave way to geometric designs. When we get to the so-called cross and pellet series of approximately the 15th century, we start to get some examples being recorded through the PAS, but exclusively through Thames foreshore finds. So unless you are working with mudlarked finds, you're unlikely to see these. However, some examples have been found elsewhere, in Salisbury for example. These can be seen in Jeff Egan's section on lead tin alloy metalwork in Saunders' 2001 Salisbury Medieval Catalogue Volume 3. As we leave the medieval period, matters become slightly more complicated with the proliferation of tokens. We're on safe ground with a particular series known as the St Nicholas Boy Bishop tokens. These were cast in lead, mainly in Bury St Edmunds, but also in Ely, Sudbury and Ipswich during the period 1485 to 1555, so that includes a minor return during the reign of Mary I. They relate to the temporary reign of a boy bishop between St Nicholas's Day and Childermas, that is for most of December. And they were distributed as alms. They've been divided by Riggold into 11 classes. Here you can see the London-centred distribution following the line of the Thames for the 15th century cross and pellet series, and the very Suffolk-focused distribution of the Boy Bishop tokens. When it comes to the end of the 16th century, the distribution of lead tokens becomes a lot more spread out. A specific group that can be isolated are the Elizabethan tokens, thought in part to relate to Mary Queen of Scots, although some have more recently been associated with the last 15 years or so of Elizabeth I's reign. Look out for the double-headed eagle and the crowned rose, shown here at the top. These are by far the most common, with their two different legends, and together account for over 90% of these tokens. Far rarer are those shown at the bottom, with a phoenix on the left and a rampant lion on the right. Such tokens are found in North Volume 2, apart from the phoenix example which is absent. On the far right is a fairly contemporary so-called Lion counter, named after the lion on the obverse. These again are largely London-centred in their distribution. The Elizabethan tokens are easy to isolate in time, but now we move back to our more problematic tokens. There is a mass of tokens that tend to get recorded by the PAS that are crude pieces which feature a number of different designs. Unusually for items of paranumismatica, they can have a design on one side, called uniface, or they can have a design on both faces, called biface. The difficulty comes in assigning dates to such pieces, in part because they have not received that much scholarly attention. We know from documentary evidence that a London mercer was complaining in the 1560s about vintners, grocers, chandlers, tipplers and other retailers coining tokens of lead for use instead of small change, but that can only be used in the establishments in which they were coined. Though this is London, other evidence points to a customer-led demand for small change in the later 16th century, such as the copper alloy tokens issued in Bristol from the 1570s and lead tokens issued in Norwich in the 1580s. So, overall, we are seeing the need for such things coming through in the literature of the Tudor period. Turning to the evidence of the objects themselves, a number of examples feature dates. In general, tokens have been documented with dates ranging from the 1610s to the early 19th century. In London, tokens with initials began in the mid-16th century, and letters continue through the period of the 17th century trade tokens and so on. But what then of the tokens with a long cross and pellets, such as the one pictured middle right? These are often documented on the database as medieval. On the one hand, the design alludes to the common medieval coin reverse design. On the other, often only one pellet is shown in each quarter, rather than the normal 3. Furthermore, a mould has been found with such a reverse paired with initials which are demonstrably late. This is presumably why Brian Reed, when he publishes some lead tokens in Metal Artifacts of Antiquity, supposes they are most likely to be 18th century in date. Overall, then, we would argue for a presumption that all of these crude tokens are broad period post-medieval, unless there are strong grounds to suggest otherwise. We can use the certainty qualifiers to indicate our levels of confidence in the dating we are assigning to them. When recording lead tokens, they go down as token for the object type. There's no need to fill in the classification or subclassification. We've mentioned that the majority will be likely to be post-medieval as the broad period. Lead tokens were cast in moulds, so we can add that as the method of manufacture. Unfortunately, the massive crude tokens are a reflection of the mixed raw materials available, so they can be pure lead or they can be lead alloys. Use your judgment following the usual conventions for deciding between the two when you fill in the primary material field. In terms of classification, we use the high-level system devised by David Powell. Powell has come up with 37 types at last count, which relate to designs, such as initials, type 2, or buildings, type 23, for example. Each type is very clearly defined in the classification, and he takes you through which types to use very nicely. Unusually for a classification, only part of an object gets classified, a face in this case, rather than the whole thing. Of course, this is fine if your token is uniface, but for others you have to quote both relevant types. For example, the piece pictured here top left has crossed keys on one side, which is PAL type 21, and cross-hatching on the other, which is PAL type 7. The attribution of obverse and reverse is arbitrary here. Convention dictates, though, that initials are considered to be the obverse of biface tokens, and that clearer designs are deemed to be the obverse when paired with less clear designs. Unfortunately, the Jetton or token drop-down form on the database has a key problem when it comes to recording the details on lead tokens. The problem is that for the form to save, you have to select a denomination. For non-Jettons, 3 monetary equivalents are currently offered, which is fine for trade tokens, which we know to be mostly farthing or halfpenny denominated, but for lead tokens there is little way of knowing. Until this is rectified, do not use the Jetton token data form for lead tokens. Instead, record details of the obverse and reverse of your lead token in the object description field. Now let's turn to copper alloy tokens. If we think back to our timeline, we have tokens in copper alloys really coming in the 17th century, with some antecedents in the later 16th century. In terms of what we record on the database, we are mainly focused on the trade token phenomenon of the mid to late 17th century, rather than later tokens. Later tokens include the provincial series of the late 18th century and the succeeding series of the early 19th century. They also include things like hop tokens, gambling tokens, communion tokens, cooperative checks, and pub tokens, which are generally even more recent still. If you do come across any of these, you will presumably recognise them for their lightweight and modern appearance, and often they feature a lot of text. Their large size puts them in the last throes of commodity money, whereby the value of the metal was tied to the value given to the piece. It was in this same period within wider coinage that representative money was introduced. The preceding spate of provincial tokens occurred between 1787 and 1796. These are also quite big and have milled edges. They come in halfpenny and penny denominations, and they feature large images and long legends, including often around the edge. They are generally called Conder tokens after James Conder, a contemporary collector and cataloguer from Ipswich. We tend to attribute references using a work originally published in 1910 and available in reprints by Dalton and Hamer. This work is divided up by area of issue and also includes a useful index at the back. There is hopefully therefore no danger in confusing any of these with the trade tokens of the previous century. However, there is some potential for confusing other things with trade tokens of the 17th century, and vice versa. There is a possibility that very worn trade tokens might get confused with very worn farthings of the preceding period. Note that for the successive farthings issued by Lord Harrington, then the Duke of Lennox under James I, and the Duchess of Richmond, then Lord Maltravers under Charles I, the obverse crown and sceptres, or the reverse crowned harp. Also note the often thin fabric used for these coins compared to the tokens. For the rose farthings of Charles I, look for the crown and sceptres again and a crowned rose. An additional bit of help with rose farthings is that they often include a wedge-shaped brass insert put there to negate counterfeiting. Even when it's hard to see the designs, you can often spot the insert. There's also a possibility that a trade token might get mistaken for a 4th century Roman nummus. In such instances, look carefully for either the bust on the nummus or the geometric forms or triads of initials that you often get on trade tokens. In Bristol, copper alloy tokens were struck on square or nearly square flans between around 1577 and 1583. These are the antecedents of the plentiful series of trade tokens, which operated generally on a local basis in the mid to late 17th century, as a response to an absence of small change in the monetary system. These Bristol tokens are therefore easy to spot. It should be noted, though, that within the 17th century series there are a few tokens of unusual form, such as octagonal and heart-shaped tokens. 17th century trade tokens are quite easy to identify because they are crammed full of information. In other words, there are lots of ways in. The problem comes when, due to corrosion or wear, some of this information is absent. Trade tokens often have common features, so what we'd like to do is take you through the anatomy of a typical trade token farthing. One of the clearest divisions within this token series is between civic, that is on behalf of urban authorities, and private issues. Here is a typical 17th century trade token. They often have an inner circle, shown here as ropework, which separates on the obverse the design in the middle from the inscription or legend around it. You can also see some of an outer toothed border which disappears off the flan in certain places. The legend is often a continuous statement across the obverse and reverse. The start of the legend can be discerned using the initial mark, here a 5-pointed star, and can then be traced clockwise around the obverse, and the process repeated for the reverse. Together, we get a Christian name and surname, followed by of, then the place name and the date. On the obverse here we have a design, and within the inner circle on the reverse a pair of initials, FF. These refer to Francis Fielder, so by abstraction we can say that the initials on a trade token should relate to the issuer. As you can see, there's an awful lot of information contained within these small tokens. Here, for example, we have an issuer's name, the place of issue, the date of issue, and a hint at profession or social status in the presence of a sugarloaf. If the case needed to be made for recording 17th century trade tokens, one could mention that they provide biographical data which can contribute to economic and social history, and that they intersect with other forms of documentary evidence, such as parish registers, wills, and court records. There is also interesting archaeological analysis of their circulation, which has only been done so far in a limited way, so plenty of potential for research. By using standard reference books for trade tokens, we're trying to extract every single bit of information we can out of a trade token, and we're trying to standardise their recording by attributing reference numbers to them. Over 14,000 different types are known overall, and we need to be able to get a handle on all of this data. All of the literature follows a similar structure: division into historic English counties and subdivision into place of issue. Thus, if you know where your token was issued, you can give it the relevant reference number quite easily. There is generally an index of places of issue at the back. Reference numbers are based on a particular work by G.C. Williamson. Williamson listed around 12,700 different examples and, as mentioned, many more have been established since. The numbering as set out by Williamson is thankfully maintained in the follow-up works. The Norweb volumes are the most up-to-date and the best illustrated. Once you trace your example, you can compare it to a published piece. Norweb gives weights and die-axis measurements, for example. It, as well as the token, will give you the name of the issuer and the date of issue. The published examples can also help with denominations if the token doesn't already say halfpenny on it. Denominations are generally either farthing or halfpenny. Pennies are rare outside London and Ireland. When recording copper alloy tokens, they go down as token for the object type. As before, there's no need to fill in the classification or subclassification fields, as we'll be completing a numismatic data form later on. In the object description field, ideally a reference number will be provided as part of the opening sentence in the description. They will all be post-medieval for broad period. Dating is often given on the token, while the more general dating is 1648 to 1672 for 17th century trade tokens, with a range of 1656 to 1672 applicable to trade token halfpennies and 1663 to 1672 for trade token pennies. Conda tokens tend to have the date on them. When they do not, they can be dated 1787 to 1796. 17th century trade tokens were struck using square iron dies made in London, so they can be put down as struck or hammered for their method of manufacture. Conda tokens and early 19th century tokens are sufficiently late to be milled. It's hard to distinguish between copper and brass used for trade tokens, so copper alloy is their primary material. Thankfully, the problems with the Jetton or token form on the database do not affect the copper alloy tokens, so it's safe to use. However, remember they are designed for recording Jettons, so there are still some issues. So the first three drop-downs, class, type and group of token, can be ignored. They are for Jettons. Instead, we go straight to the denomination drop-down, for which we can choose here farthing, halfpenny or penny. Then we miss out the next two, ruler and mint, again aimed at Jetton recording, before completing the degree of wear drop-down. Here you can see the obverse inscription field completed according to the usual conventions. Also shown is the reverse description field, so that you can see the convention for rendering the triad of initials that is often found on these tokens. For further guidance about recording Jettons and tokens onto the PAS database, check out our online finds recording guides. We have one for Jettons and one for tokens. The links are pictured here and are available in the video description.